In between trying to make my own games and helping other people make games, I like to play games myself, most specifically Japanese RPGs. And today I want to talk about Clair Obscur Expedition 33, a French JRPG released last April that achieved extraordinary success and sold millions of copies in its first month, proving that turn-based RPGs are not a thing of the past yet, along with another stellar example of the genre called Metaphor, released earlier this year. Expedition 33 achieved the highest Metacritic or user score of all time as of July 2025 with a 9.7 rating. It was made by Sandfall Interactive, which core development team includes around 30 people, many of them former Ubisoft employees. The French president calls Clair Obscur Expedition 33 a shining example of French audacity, and you even have the mayor of Montpellier congratulating the team that made the game, quoting that it would be a reference in the international history of video games. It is a good game. I'm not going to make a review of the game itself, but just know that everything is good. The art direction is phenomenal, the voice acting both in French and in English is just next level, the combat system is extremely fun, and the music is just, look. The bottom line is you have to play the game if you haven't already. Now, since the game is made by French people, it incorporates a lot of French words and references to French culture. If you don't speak a little bit of French, you may have missed a pretty good number of those, so as a French person who enjoys RPGs, I thought I would make a video about it. Now, two things before we start. It's obviously not an exhaustive list of every French reference inside this game, because there are way too many. I just picked the most interesting ones. Here's what I'm going to cover. There is a very funny private joke that the developers certainly slipped in, so I encourage you to watch until the end. Now, for very obvious reasons, it's a bit hard to make this video 100% spoiler-free. I did my best, and the really heavy spoilers will be preceded by this. But if you really want to keep everything a surprise, I recommend you play the game before watching this video. Let's jump into it. Now let's start with the name of the game, Clair Obscur. It literally translates to light dark, but like many things in this game, it's a painting reference, and more specifically a painting technique called chiaroscuro, which is the Italian for clair obscur. It uses dramatic contrast between light and dark to create depth, volume, and emotional intensity. It's not so much a reference to France as it is to Italy, as this technique was much more prominent in the latter, but it has some presence in France as well, so I thought I would mention it. A well-known example is Georges Latour, who painted a lot of religious candlelit scenes in chiaroscuro. And a more recent example is Théodore Géricault, who used chiaroscuro in dramatic secular and contemporary subjects, more famously in his monumental painting, Le Radeau de la Méduse. Now, the game itself has a lot of chiaroscuro aesthetics, and the color palette is very reminiscent of that style. Now let's move on to the characters. A bunch of names are French, and they're actually quite common. Names such as Maëlle and Sophie are quite popular to this day. I met at least 2 Maëlle and 3 Sophies when I was growing up in France. Gustave and Aline used to be common names a few decades ago, but it's rare to find people named as such now, apart from older generations. Cléa is also a recognizable name, although I've never met one myself, and same for Alicia, which is a derived version from the much more common name Alice. You could argue that some characters in the game reference actual people who existed in France. Renoir, for example, is almost certainly a reference to Pierre-Auguste Renoir, a leading French impressionist painter known for his vibrant, light-filled canvases celebrating beauty and joy. Famous works include Déjeuner des Canotiers and Bal du Moulin de la Galette. Renoir's wife in the game is named Aline, which matches the name of Pierre-Auguste Renoir's wife, Aline Charigot. There is a slightly slanted but very recognizable Eiffel Tower in the game, which was designed by Gustave Eiffel's company, but Gustave could also be a reference to Gustave Courbet, another French painter of the 19th century and a key figure of the realism movement, choosing to depict everyday normal situations. The main parallel between realism and impressionism is their focus on everyday life scenes, so you can definitely work out a connection with Renoir, although I think it would be a bit of a stretch. Gustave was a common enough name that I didn't think was a reference to anyone in specific. Now, Lune itself is not a common name, but it is the French word for moon, Ciel, I'm not 100% sure, but it is eerily similar to ciel, which is the French word for sky, and I could see it makes sense for that character. Her combat abilities involve using sun and moon techniques to trigger the twilight state. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure you can make it any clearer. Verso is not a name, but it is a word we use in French, mostly to describe the left-hand page of an open book or the backside of a single sheet of paper. For example, if we ask someone to write something au verso de la page, it means on the back of the paper. If you've played the game, I'm sure you can draw a lot of parallels between the character verso and what his name means. Now, the allegedly most powerful being in the world, Esquier. I didn't actually know what Esquier referred to while playing the game, but I've seen two plausible theories on Reddit. The first one is esquisse. It's my favorite interpretation, and it means something like a draft or a sketch. It would be thematically in line with the references to painting in the game, and while I could be wrong, I think it's implied that Esquier was drawn by Verso as a kid, because of its out-of-place, over-the-top whimsical appearance and its insane powers, so it could be a kid sketch kind of situation, but don't quote me on that. Another theory involves the use of verlan. Verlan is a form of French slang that involves reversing the syllables of words, mostly used by young people. There's no specific rule as to how you're supposed to do it, and it's more so phonetical than it is spelling-based. We often cheat a lot, but for example, some common verlan words that I still use occasionally with friends include meuf, which is originally femme, or woman. I feel like it's kind of our way of saying dude, but for a woman. I don't know, I feel like meuf and dude give me the same overall vibe, if that makes sense. You also have chelou, which is louche, or weird. To say that's really weird, you could go c'est hyper chelou. Verlan itself is the verlan contraction of l'envers, which means upside down. Anyway, Esquier could be the verlan of qui est, which means who is it, although I'm not sure it would make a lot of sense aside from saying what the hell is this thing. Esquier's rival and best friend is called François, and the way it is introduced in the game is absolutely hilarious because François is perhaps the least threatening name you could think of.
I'm strong, but I'm not that strong. I will need Flory.
Who's Flory?
One of my rocks.
Rocks?
See? Flory helps me swim. But Flory was stolen by my art nemesis. One whose every step shakes the foundation of the world. The one known as François.
Okay.
Now, enemies. Most enemies in the game have a French name. I'm not going to mention all of them because it would take forever, but here are some examples. Troubadour is the word used to describe medieval poets and musicians that existed in the south of France during the Middle Ages. You could more or less translate it as bard, and a fun fact is that in MMOs, the bard class is often used to cast buffs and debuffs, which is specifically what the Troubadour does in Expedition 33. Gustave is a very annoying mini-boss that you can only kill by avoiding his attacks, and it means big head, which was also my nickname in middle school. Visage, a pretty major boss in the game, means faces. Adequately, the place where you fight it is full of gigantic faces. Now this one I like a lot. Sakapatate. Gestrels, a race of painting brush-looking creatures in the game, build these enemies that are often called something Sakapatate. And it always made me chuckle because Sakapatate just translates to potato sack. It can be used as an insult, in which case it would mean something akin to clumsy, but more often than not you would hear it in the expression être habillé comme un sac à patates, or to be dressed like a potato sack, which means wearing something ill-fitting, unflattering, or just generally very lame, not very trendy. There are two unique enemies you will encounter several times in the game. The first one is Petank, which references la pétanque, a French ball game played on gravel courts. I'm not sure if it's still as common as it was when I was a kid, because I don't live in France anymore, but I used to play it with my dad when I was very young, and I would often see a group of older men playing la pétanque near my elementary school. Now the mime is another powerful recurrent enemy in the game, which references the eponym mime, a performer who acts out stories, emotions, and situations using only physical movements and facial expressions, without speaking. It was mostly a thing in the 19th and early to mid-20th centuries. It's not impossible to see mimes even today in some streets of Paris, for example, but it's pretty rare. I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen one myself. Now, naturally, lots of places are also French words or real places in France. Pretty obvious one is the main city of the game, Lumière, which means light. I'm sure everyone called that one, but the infrastructure and overall vibe of Lumière is very reminiscent of Paris from the French Belle Époque, which was a period of remarkable prosperity, cultural flourishing, and technological advancement in France between the Franco-Prussian War and World War I. Current-day Paris is still fairly similar to what you can see in the game, if you forget about the bike lanes and the pedestrian zones that have been added since. Additionally, as I mentioned previously, there is even a version of the Eiffel Tower close by and a very damaged Arc de Triomphe inside the city, two of the most popular, if not the most popular, landmarks in Paris. Now let's talk about the combat. Maël's fighting style draws heavily from fencing, a very popular sport in France that uses French lingo even outside of France. For example, there are 3 types of weapons you can use: épée, sabre, and fleuret, the latest being referred to as foil in English. The referee usually uses French words such as en garde, prêt, allez to kickstart the fights.
En garde. Prêt. Allez.
And landing an attack on the opponent is called toucher or touch. Maël herself can be heard saying en garde sometimes when you start a fight. Maël's skills contain a lot of French words. Percer means breakthrough or piercing attack. Égide is aegis. Finally, Stendhal, an extremely powerful move that refers to the pen name of Marie-Henri Beyle, a major French novelist and writer of the Romantic period. Stendhal is one of those authors you absolutely can't avoid during literature classes in France. I had to read Le Rouge et le Noir in high school, and you know what? Even for my developing brain at the time, it was a pretty enjoyable read. My literature teacher would kill me for saying that, but in very loose terms, it's kind of like a French classical literature version of Bridgerton, because they both involve love stories and gossips of the noble class, except Le Rouge et le Noir is much darker and cynical. As for the music, I'm not going to expand much on that because the soundtrack is just fantastic and you should definitely experience it in the game. But just know that a lot of the lyrics are French, Latin, or a mix of both, and they directly reference the lore of the game. Even in the English dub, voice actors still use French words as is. In the world of Clair Obscur Expedition 33, the paintress, a mysterious figure, paints a countdown on the monolith. The number goes down every year, and each time the paintress paints a new number, peoples whose age is the one indicated on the monolith perish. This phenomenon is called gommage and simply means erasure. Another example I would be amiss not to mention is that French swearing words are also present in the English script, to throw in some extra authenticity. And the voice actors in the game pronounce them with an impressively good accent.
Putain de merde.
When you beat the most powerful Petank in the game, you earn a trophy called Carreau Parfait, which is a move in Petank used to describe taking the exact place of the targeted ball with yours. There is a secret boss you can find floating in the sky in Expedition 33, a huge snake-looking figure called Serpent Phare. Now, in and of itself, that's not a very telling name, although you could dissect it into Serpent and Phare. What's more interesting, however, is that the trophy you get for beating this boss is named Aon. If you put them together, you get Serpent Pharaon, and Pharaon references a joke in one of the most famous comedic French movies of all times, Astérix et Obélix, Mission Cléopâtre. It's difficult to explain this joke to non-French speakers, but essentially it's a play on words between Pharaon and Pharaon.
Et le mec lui dit, c'est le phare à on. Parce qu'il s'appelle On, le mec. Le mec s'appelle On. Il dit et comme il avait un phare. Il dit c'est le phare à On. Le mec s'appelle On.
A scene in the game mentions Verso stashing his wine inside Esquier, implying that Esquier is just a giant outravin, or wineskin. Finally, in the game, after beating the mime several times, you can unlock a similar costume for every character, which is a very outdated, yet typical French attire, often worn by mimes. Ironically, this is what cosplayers have been wearing more often than the actual canon outfits, because it's pretty easy to put together and immediately recognizable. Now, that's all the references I could remember, but of course, the game has a lot more. If you've noticed another one that I did not mention in this this video, tell me in the comments. And if you'd like to see me discuss other RPGs that I've liked, please let me know, because I'm still trying to figure out what kind of content I want to publish in this channel. Thank you for watching and see you next time.